War almost started in a quiet stretch of ocean. One mistake, one unanswered question, and a routine patrol slipped into the opening seconds of a conflict no one was ready to name. At 14:17 local time, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Stone was doing what it had done dozens of times before. The deck was cluttered with evidence bags and sealed bundles from a successful narcotics seizure. Millions of dollars in illicit cargo had been taken off the water. The crew was tired, focused, and already shifting back into patrol rhythm. Engines steady, radios calm, the sea indifferent. Nothing suggested that the next few minutes would decide whether an international incident became something far worse. Radar contact changed everything. 3 fast, moving surface tracks appeared almost at once. Tight formation, no broadcast, no identification, no course correction. They weren't passing through, they were converging. The Stone's combat watch flagged the approach, then watched the range collapse faster than expected. In international waters, speed without communication is never accidental. The bridge went quiet as calculations replaced conversation. You could feel it before anyone said it. Something was wrong. The first shot arrived without warning. A heavy round slammed into the cutter's stern, tearing through exposed equipment and shredding antennas in a spray of metal. The impact rocked the ship hard enough to throw sailors off balance. Alarms erupted. Smoke rolled across the deck. 7 crew members went down in seconds, wounded by shrapnel and debris. There had been no hail, no challenge, no signal, just sudden violence. In naval terms, that absence mattered as much as the strike itself. It erased ambiguity. This was no misunderstanding. Stone responded with discipline, not panic. The cutter's gun crew brought the main battery to bear and fired controlled bursts toward the nearest contact. Not to destroy, to disrupt, to create space. Damage control teams were already moving, sealing compartments and fighting the first fire while medics dragged the injured clear. Training took over where shock threatened to paralyze. The ship was smaller, lighter, and outgunned, but it was not helpless. Not yet. The 3 vessels pressed in. They maneuvered with intent, spreading to cut off angles, forcing the Stone to react instead of escape. One crossed the bow close enough to force a hard turn. Another slid down the starboard side, closing the distance where small arms fire would matter. The third lingered aft, matching speed, blocking retreat. It wasn't random. It was a textbook encirclement. The implication was unmistakable. Boarding was the objective. Fires multiplied below decks. Heat built near critical systems as damage control teams fought to keep propulsion stable. Every course correction cost power. Every minute burned fuel and time the cutter didn't have. The bridge tracked ranges and bearings while the deck crew worked through smoke so thick it blurred faces. The Stone was still fighting, but the balance was tilting. You could feel the pressure closing, not just in meters, but in options. Then the mayday went out. At 14:19, the cutter broadcast its distress call across emergency channels. Coordinates, situation, injuries. The message was short because it had to be. There was no bandwidth for drama. The signal punched through satellite relays and command networks, landing on screens beyond the Caribbean. In an instant, this stopped being a patrol problem. It became a strategic one. Within moments, the engagement was reclassified. What commanders saw was not a skirmish. It was a confirmed hostile attack on a U.S. vessel operating legally in international waters. Alert statuses shifted. Staff officers leaned forward. The map changed color. Decisions that normally took hours were compressed into seconds. The cost of delay was obvious, and the window for prevention was closing fast. Back on the water, the attackers sensed momentum. Another round struck lower, closer to the waterline. The shock rippled through the hull. A second fire ignited. The cutter listed briefly before correcting. Damage reports stacked up faster than they could be cleared. The Stone's crew fought to buy time, knowing exactly what failure would look like. If propulsion went, boarding would follow. If boarding followed, the situation would become irreversible. The cutter refused to break. The gun fired again, measured and relentless, forcing the nearest vessel to widen its turn. It wasn't dominance, it was resistance, enough to slow the advance, enough to complicate timing. In naval warfare, seconds matter. The Stone's crew understood that survival wasn't about winning, it was about lasting. Orders went out without spectacle. U.S. naval assets adjusted course and speed, their movements invisible to anyone not looking for them. No announcements, no warnings, just controlled acceleration and silent alignment. Power didn't rush. It arrived deliberately. On the cutter, the minutes stretched. Fire crews worked through exhaustion. Engineers balanced failing systems. Medics stabilized the wounded while the bridge tracked closing distances. The attackers hovered just outside collision range, testing reactions, probing for weakness. They had started confident. Now they watched more carefully. Something had changed, though they couldn't yet see what. Time became the battlefield. The stone held its line, turning when forced, firing when necessary, refusing to present an easy angle. It was not a display of force. It was a display of resolve, enough to survive, enough to keep the situation from tipping over the edge, and that restraint mattered, because escalation doesn't begin with explosions. It begins when one side believes the other has no limits. The stone proved otherwise, not by overpowering its attackers, but by denying them certainty. No missiles streaked the sky. No aircraft roared overhead. Just smoke, steel, and disciplined resistance in international waters. The world edged closer to something dangerous without most people realizing it. Help was moving. The crew didn't need to see it yet. They only needed to believe it was possible. That belief held the line long enough for decisions made far away to begin reshaping the outcome. In modern warfare, survival often depends on the moments before dominance arrives. Some ships are not meant to be tested. War didn't announce itself with sirens. It crept in through radar returns and unanswered calls. In those first seconds, escalation wasn't certain, but it was close enough to feel. The second strike removed all doubt. What began as an unexplained hit became a confirmed attack, and every officer watching the feed understood the same truth at the same time. This was no longer confusion at sea. This was intent. Venezuelan naval vessels were pressing their advantage, closing distance, firing again, maneuvering with purpose. Ambiguity vanished the moment steel hit steel twice. After that, there were only decisions. On the water, the U.S. cutter was still fighting to stay afloat. Fires burned where there had been routine deck work minutes earlier. Damage teams moved fast, disciplined, silent. The crew did not ask why this was happening. They focused on surviving it, but above the smoke and the chaos, something else was happening quietly. The situation had crossed a threshold. Data began flowing outward. Sensors, damage reports, positional data, live feeds. Everything the cutter could transmit poured into U.S. command networks. What looked like a localized clash from the horizon was already expanding in scope. Screens lit up at U.S. Fourth Fleet. Analysts traced trajectories. Officers marked patterns. The picture sharpened by the second, and the conclusion hardened just as fast. A U.S. ship was under coordinated attack in international waters. That was the moment policy became force. Notification moved upward without drama. The National Command Authority was briefed in clipped language, stripped of emotion. There was no need for exaggeration. The facts were enough. Hostile action confirmed. American lives at risk. The window to act was narrow, and everyone in the chain understood what delay would mean. This wasn't about retaliation. It was about control. Orders went out. Far beyond the cutter's line of sight, 2 destroyers changed posture. USS Gravely and USS Porter did not announce their movement. They didn't broadcast warnings or issue threats. They simply accelerated. Engines pushed to the limit. Courses tightened. What mattered was speed, not spectacle. Power was already on the move, faster than headlines, faster than speculation, faster than anyone not watching the right screens could react to. At sea level, the attackers still believed they held the advantage. They maneuvered aggressively, boxing the cutter, testing angles, closing gaps. Confidence showed in their movement. They had numbers. They had heavier weapons. They had initiative. What they did not have was awareness of how quickly the balance was shifting. In modern conflict, the most dangerous mistake is believing the fight is contained. Minutes later, the battlespace changed. USS Gravely's sensors reached out and took hold of the situation with calm precision. Radar sweeps resolved every contact. Electronic signatures confirmed identities. Positions, headings, weapon arcs. Nothing was guessed. Everything was known. The cutter's data stream merged seamlessly into the destroyer's tactical picture, transforming chaos into clarity. For the first time since the opening strike, the entire engagement made sense. And with clarity came authority. The threats were no longer theoretical. They were defined, lethal, active. The decision point arrived without ceremony. Authorization was granted not in anger, but in certainty. The calculus was simple. Allow the attack to continue and risk an irreversible outcome, or end it decisively and prevent escalation from spiraling beyond control. Then this happened. USS gravely executed its launch sequence with methodical precision. No countdowns, no raised voices, systems cycled, safeties disengaged, targeting solutions locked. The missiles left their cells cleanly, deliberately, committing to paths calculated long before the first impact would be felt. There was no chaos in the action, only inevitability. The effect was immediate. Within minutes, the engagement that had threatened to spiral was rewritten entirely. The attacking vessels, moments earlier confident and aggressive, were forced into a reality they had not planned for. Sensors failed, maneuvers faltered, formations broke. The certainty they had projected collapsed under the weight of overwhelming precision they could neither match nor escape. From the cutter's deck, the shift was unmistakable. Pressure eased where it had been relentless. The vessels that had closed in now hesitated. One altered course, another slowed. The third fell back, suddenly cautious, suddenly aware that the rules of the encounter had changed. The silence that followed was not relief, it was recognition. U.S. naval power did not chase, it did not gloat, it did not escalate further. It held that restraint mattered more than the strike itself. Because dominance in modern warfare is not measured by how loudly force is applied, but by how quickly behavior changes, the mission was not destruction. It was control of the outcome, and the outcome was clear. The threat had been neutralized, the situation stabilized. The edge of a wider conflict was stepped back from, not with speeches, but with disciplined action. For the attackers, the lesson arrived too late to ignore. What began as confidence ended in hesitation. What looked like an opportunity revealed itself as a miscalculation. The sea returned to an uneasy calm, broken only by drifting smoke and unanswered questions. No declarations followed, no victory statements were made, none were needed. The world would debate legality later, analysts would argue narratives, but on the water, the truth was already settled. In modern warfare, power is most dangerous when it doesn't need to move. The missiles did not announce themselves with noise, they announced the end of choice. For a brief moment, the Caribbean held its breath, and the world came closer to war than anyone realized. Minutes earlier, confidence still lived on the decks of the Venezuelan vessels. Orders had been given, lines had been crossed. What began as pressure had turned into open challenge, and challenge into violence. They believed escalation could be managed. They believed distance and ambiguity would protect them. That belief died first. The strikes came with clinical precision, not dramatic, not chaotic, simply final. Sensors locked, trajectories calculated, permissions already granted long before anyone on the opposing ships understood what was happening. When the missiles hit, there was no prolonged exchange, no back and forth, just impact, fire, and sudden loss of control. Two vessels were disabled almost instantly, their propulsion gone, their command spaces shattered. A third, realizing the same fate awaited it, slowed, turned, and stopped. A white flag rose not out of tradition, but out of survival. Shock moved faster than smoke. Crews who moments earlier believed they were shaping events now struggled to understand how quickly those events had turned against them. The sea, once crowded with intent, became a place of wreckage and drifting debris. Radios that had been loud fell silent. Commands stopped flowing. The engagement ended not because someone ordered it to stop, but because it could no longer continue. And then, something unexpected happened. The guns went quiet everywhere. not just on the damaged ships, but across the entire battlespace. Radar screens that had been dense with contacts now showed distance increasing, formations dissolving, threats withdrawing. The Caribbean transformed in minutes, shifting from a contested battlefield into a wide, uneasy calm broken only by fire suppression systems and the sound of water rushing into compromised hulls. This is where power often reveals its true nature. U.S. ships did not advance aggressively. They did not posture. They held position, calm, controlled, unreadable. The same discipline that guided the strikes now governed what followed. Orders changed not toward destruction, but toward preservation. Rescue teams were launched, medical crews prepared, helicopters lifted off not to hunt, but to save. Sailors who had fired moments earlier were now pulling wounded enemy crewmen from the water. Hands that had operated weapons were applying tourniquets. Voices that had delivered combat commands now spoke quietly, deliberately, offering reassurance in a language that needed no translation. The message was unmistakable. The fight was over because it had been decided, not because it had spiraled. This transition is what many never understand about modern dominance. It is not defined by how much force is used, but by how precisely it can be stopped. For the Venezuelan command structure, the realization came in waves. The first was operational. Their vessels were lost, disabled, or captured. The second was psychological. Escalation had failed completely. The third was strategic and far more dangerous. They had tested a red line they did not fully understand, and the response had not been negotiable. Casualty reports began to form. Numbers replaced assumptions. Families would receive calls that would reshape lives. Ships that represented national pride would never sail again. And all of it traced back to a single miscalculation, the belief that controlled aggression would go unanswered, or answered slowly, or answered loudly enough to invite sympathy. Instead, it was answered with silence and certainty. Across command centers far from the Caribbean, analysts studied the timeline. Minutes mattered. Decisions made quietly, without speeches or statements, had altered the balance instantly. Markets would react. Insurance premiums would rise. Shipping routes would be reconsidered, not because of a prolonged war, but because of a short, decisive demonstration of control. This is how modern conflict reshapes the world without headlines keeping pace. There was no victory parade, no declaration, no need. The lesson had already been delivered. When force met superior awareness, restraint, and preparation, the outcome was not dramatic escalation. It was termination. Clean, unavoidable, and deeply unsettling to anyone watching closely, the surrendered vessel remained under guard, its crew accounted for, its weapons secured. The disabled ships smoldered as damage control teams fought to keep them afloat long enough for rescue. The sea, indifferent as ever, carried debris outward, erasing visible evidence even as the consequences spread far beyond the horizon. For those who initiated the confrontation, the most painful realization came last. They had not forced the United States into chaos. They had forced it into clarity, and clarity is far more dangerous than anger. Naval power in this moment was not loud. It did not linger. It did not need to prove itself repeatedly. It acted once, decisively, and then shifted immediately to restraint. That contrast overwhelming force followed by immediate control sent a message no broadcast ever could. Future planners would study this incident not for its violence, but for its brevity. They would note how escalation ended the moment dominance became undeniable. They would recognize that modern red lines are not always announced, and that testing them can produce consequences faster than diplomacy can react. The Caribbean returned to routine shipping lanes within days. Official statements were measured, carefully worded, but beneath the surface something had changed, confidence had moved, assumptions had shattered. And a reminder settled quietly into strategic thinking across the globe. In the end, no city burned, no war was declared, yet the warning was clear, written not in speeches or sanctions, but in action and restraint. Power, when exercised correctly, does not need to chase, it waits, and when it moves, it ends the argument,